Before we begin today's episode, I need to address the sensitive nature of this content. We're discussing the weaponization of fake suicide threats within abusive relationships. This conversation may be triggering for those who have experienced these tactics or who have struggled with genuine suicidal thoughts. Please only continue listening if it is safe for you to do so. If you are in immediate danger, contact your local emergency services. If you're experiencing genuine suicidal thoughts, please reach out to a crisis helpline. These services exist specifically to help people in genuine distress. This episode focuses specifically on how false threats of suicide can be weaponized as tools of coercive control. We're examining one of the most insidious aspects of psychological abuse, how something as critical as suicide, which should command our immediate compassion and professional intervention, can be deliberately used to manipulate and control others. This weaponization creates devastating confusion because it blurs the essential boundary between genuine calls for help and calculated emotional blackmail. Understanding this distinction is crucial. Genuine suicidal ideation deserves our full compassion, immediate attention, and professional support. The manipulation of false suicide threats as a control tactic represents a profound betrayal of that compassion. Today, we explore how to recognize patterns that suggest manipulation while maintaining our capacity to respond appropriately to any suicide threat. Because, regardless of intent, professional intervention is always the right response. For those of you who are still with me for this episode, let's get into this difficult topic. Picture this moment. You're having what should be a normal conversation about boundaries, or maybe you've just said no to something that in your mind was perfectly reasonable. Suddenly, their voice drops, their eyes change, and then come the words that make your world stop. If you do not change, I will kill myself. In the moment, your heart pounds so loudly in your ears you can't hear anything else. Your mouth goes dry. Every protective instinct you have screams that you are now responsible for preventing a death. In that instant, whatever you were discussing becomes irrelevant. If it was your needs, your boundaries, your reality, everything evaporates in the face of what appears to be a life or death emergency. What you don't see in that moment is how precisely timed those words were, how they emerged exactly when you were asserting independence or setting a limit. You don't see the calculation behind the delivery, the way your natural protective instincts are being weaponized against you. Instead, you see someone you love in mortal danger, and you feel responsible for keeping them alive. This is psychological entrapment at its most devastating. It transforms your capacity for love into chains. Your empathy becomes the weapon they use to control you. That is the topic of today's episode, where we explore fake threats of suicide as a tool of coercive control and entrapment. We'll explore what makes this tactic so psychologically effective, how to recognize the patterns that help you distinguish manipulation from genuine crisis, the devastating impact these threats have on your mental health and identity, and the specific ways this abuse affects men. We'll discuss why professional intervention is always the right response, regardless of intent. And we'll look at practical strategies for protecting yourself while still responding appropriately to any suicide threat. For those of you who are new here, this is Stand Again, a lived experience platform for male victims of family violence. Abuse is not limited to one gender, but this channel focuses on the male perspective because it is so often ignored or misunderstood. If this content helps you, please like, subscribe, and type the words Stand Again into the chat. Those two words might just help another man find his. False threats of suicide as an entrapment tactic represent one of the most psychologically devastating forms of emotional blackmail within an abusive relationship. This manipulation transforms the victim's natural protective instincts into instruments of control, creating a closed system where the victim becomes responsible for preventing the abuser's death through the victim's compliance and victim's sacrifice. The fundamental structure is deceptively simple. The abuser creates a direct causal link between the victim's behavior and the abuser's survival. If you leave me, I will kill myself. If you don't make me happy, I will not live. You're the only thing keeping me alive. The victim in this situation is positioned as both the cause of the suicidal ideation and also the only possible solution to it. This creates what psychologists call false agency, where you feel completely responsible for preventing catastrophe while having no real power to address the underlying issues that supposedly create the suicidal thoughts. When victims suggest professional help or offer to organize it for the abuser typically shuts it down. They insist that no doctor, no therapist, or crisis service can help, and that only your change in behavior or your continued compliance will keep the abuser alive. This refusal of external intervention is deliberate. It ensures that the victim remains the sole solution, reinforcing the closed loop of false agency and keeping professional support and accountability completely out of reach. What makes this tactic so effective is how it exploits the neurobiological responses that have kept humans alive for millennia. When someone we love appears to be in mortal danger, our prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, goes offline. The limbic system floods us with stress hormones, demanding immediate action to prevent loss. Our attachment systems, evolved over millions of years, are wired to respond to threats of abandonment or death with immediate compliance. Rational analysis becomes impossible when someone's life appears to hang in the balance. The manipulative use of suicide threats hijacks these survival responses and redirects them towards control. The abuser understands intuitively that threats of death bypass conscious thought and trigger primal fear responses. They recognize that most people, especially those with strong protective instincts, will sacrifice almost anything to prevent someone's death. The victim becomes trapped in a state of chronic hypervigilance, constantly monitoring the abuser's emotional state, walking on eggshells, sacrificing their own needs to prevent the threatened catastrophe. Research in trauma bonding shows that these threats actually increase the victim's attachment to the abuser. Each threat reinforces the message that the victim is essential to the abuser's survival, creating a false sense of being desperately needed that masks the underlying control dynamic. The victim begins to mistake their hypervigilance for love, their compliance for caring, and their sacrifice for devotion. Understanding why abusers fake suicide threats reveals the calculated nature of this manipulation. These threats represent the nuclear option in psychological warfare, the ultimate trump card that instantly wins every argument, dissolves every boundary, and stops every attempt at independence. For the abuser, this tactic delivers multiple strategic advantages that other forms of manipulation just cannot match. The immediate compliance suicide threats generate is unparalleled. No other manipulation creates such instant behavioral change in the victim. The moment those words are spoken, whatever disagreement was occurring ends. Whatever boundary was being set gets abandoned. Whatever independence was being asserted gets sacrificed. The abuser gains immediate victory without having to negotiate, compromise, or engage with the victim's actual concerns. They learn that threatening death is more effective than any other form of coercion. The long term control these threats establish extends far beyond the moments when they are actually made. The victim begins modifying their behavior constantly to avoid triggering another threat. They stop asserting needs, abandon plans that might upset their partner, and sacrifice opportunities that could lead to independence. The abuser achieves comprehensive behavioral control while rarely having to actually repeat the threat again. The fear of triggering another crisis becomes a constant presence in the victim's decision making process. The moral high ground these threats establish is particularly insidious. The abuser transforms themselves from the aggressor into the vulnerable victim who needs protection. Meanwhile, the actual victim gets reframed as a potential murderer whose selfishness might cause a death. This moral reversal makes it almost impossible for the victim to maintain perspective about who is actually being harmed in the relationship. The abuser's needs become matters of life and death, while the victim's needs become evidence of dangerous selfishness. The accountability avoidance these threats provide is another crucial benefit for the abuser. When confronted with their harmful behavior, controlling demands, or unreasonable expectations, they can deflect all criticism by threatening suicide. Any attempt to discuss relationship problems gets reframed as risking someone's life. The victim learns to stop raising concerns, stop requesting changes, and stop expecting accountability because doing so might trigger another threat. The isolation these threats create serves the abuser's agenda perfectly. Victims become reluctant to discuss their relationship with friends, family, or therapists because they fear being judged for staying with someone who threatens suicide or being judged for someone who might cause that in someone else. They worry that others won't understand the life or death stakes they believe that they are managing. This isolation prevents external voices from providing perspective that might help the victim recognize the manipulation at play here, and the abuser gains exclusive influence over the victim's understanding of reality. The dependency these threats create transforms the relationship dynamic from partnership into caretaking. The victim's role shifts to suicide prevention specialist. Their entire existence becomes organized around monitoring and managing the abuser's emotional state. This dependency gives the abuser unprecedented power because the victim feels their partner's survival depends on their constant self sacrifice. The abuser gains multiple advantages from this tactic without having to resort to physical violence. They achieve total compliance, avoid accountability, establish moral superiority, create isolation, and generate dependency, all through the strategic use of a fake threat of self harm. This makes fake suicide threats particularly attractive to abusers who want maximum control with minimal risk of external intervention or legal consequences. A sophisticated aspect of fake suicide threat manipulation extends beyond the private relationship dynamics and into how these threats are weaponized to control social and legal narratives about the abuser and victim. This external manipulation creates additional layers of entrapment that make escape even more difficult and recovery more complex. The abuser understands that suicide threats carry enormous social weight and moral authority. When they reveal their suicide struggles to family, friends, colleagues, or legal professionals, they automatically position themselves as the vulnerable party who needs protection from you. Meanwhile, you become cast as the person whose behavior is causing someone to want to die. This narrative reversal transforms the actual victim into the apparent aggressor within the eyes of others. Your attempts to set boundaries, seek support, or even leave the relationship get reframed through this suicidal narrative as cruel abandonment of someone in mortal crisis. When you tell friends you're struggling in the relationship, they might even respond with, but they are in distress. You can't leave someone when they are that vulnerable. When you explain feeling controlled or manipulated, others might even say they're just crying out for help. Mental illness makes people act differently. The abuser's threats become a shield that deflects scrutiny of their behavior, while painting your self protection as heartless and selfishness. This narrative control becomes particularly devastating in legal contexts. Family court proceedings, custody disputes, or restraining order applications become complicated when the abuser has fabricated a documented history of suicidal ideation. Their fake threats get reframed as evidence of mental health struggles that deserve compassion rather than accountability. The selective disclosure of these threats to different audiences reveals their strategic nature. The abuser might share their suicidal ideation with your mutual friends while never mentioning it to their own support network. They might document their mental health struggles with professionals while maintaining normal functioning at work. This selective sharing ensures maximum sympathy from your social circle while avoiding comprehensive intervention that might reveal the manipulative patterns. The long term impact on your social identity can persist even after the relationship ends. The community narrative that you abandoned someone suicidal, caused someone's mental health crisis, or failed to provide adequate support follows you into future relationships and social connections. Rebuilding your reputation requires not just healing from the abuse, but actively correcting false narratives about your character and behavior. The psychological impact of living with weaponized false suicide threats extends far beyond the immediate crisis moments. These threats create profound and lasting changes in how you think, feel, and relate to yourself and others. Understanding these impacts helps explain why recovery is so complex and why the effects can linger long after the threatening relationship ends. The most immediate impact is the development of what trauma specialists call hyper responsibility, an overwhelming sense of being accountable for outcomes that are actually beyond your control. You become convinced that your partner's emotional state, their will to live, their basic survival depends entirely on your behavior. Every interaction gets filtered through the question, will this trigger another threat? This hyper responsibility is exhausting and gradually erodes your sense of having any legitimate needs or rights within the relationship. Your decision making process becomes fundamentally altered. Normal life choices, career opportunities, social activities, even basic daily decisions get evaluated based on how they might affect your partner's suicidal ideation. You might turn down a promotion because the increased work demands might upset them. You stop seeing friends because social activities might take attention away from monitoring their emotional state. You abandon hobbies, interests, and goals because they feel selfish when someone's life apparently hangs in the balance. Your relationship with your own emotions becomes distorted. Feelings of anger, frustration, disappointment, and even just normal sadness begin to feel dangerous because they might upset your partner and trigger suicidal ideation. You learn to suppress authentic emotional responses and instead perform the emotional states that keep your partner stable. This emotional suppression creates a profound disconnect from your own inner experience. For those who are interested, I'll put the link above for those that want to read my short book on how to reconnect with your feelings after abuse. Also, the anticipatory anxiety becomes overwhelming. You don't just experience stress during the actual threats, you live in a constant fear of the next one. This creates a condition similar to CPTSD or complex post traumatic stress disorder, where your nervous system is chronically activated even when no immediate threat is present. Simple daily activities become loaded with anxiety about whether they might somehow trigger another crisis. Your relationship with hope becomes complicated. part of you desperately wants to believe that if you just love enough, if you just sacrifice enough, if you can be perfect enough, then the threats will stop. This false hope keeps you trapped in cycles of increasing self sacrifice, desperate attempts to be perfect 100% of the time, 24/7, for fear of the impact to your abuser's life. When you begin to lose hope or you make a small mistake, the despair can be overwhelming because it feels like you are threatening someone's life. The secondary trauma of constantly managing someone else's fake threats of suicide create their own psychological injuries to you. You develop symptoms similar to those of first responders or healthcare workers who deal with life or death situations regularly. This is emotional numbing, difficulty enjoying positive experiences, chronic anxiety, and a worldview that becomes focused on preventing the next catastrophe at home. Your ability to assess relationship health becomes severely compromised. When every disagreement potentially leads to threats of suicide, normal relationship problems feel trivial by comparison. You lose perspective on what constitutes reasonable expectations in relationships because everything gets measured against the ultimate threat of death. While every suicide threat must be taken seriously and responded to with professional intervention, there are specific patterns and timing elements that can help you recognize when threats are being weaponized for coercive control. Understanding these patterns does not change how you should respond. Professional help is always appropriate, but it can help you maintain perspective about the relationship dynamics and protect your own mental health. The most significant indicator is timing. Manipulative suicide threats have an uncanny ability to emerge precisely when you are asserting a boundary, expressing a need, or making autonomous decisions. The threat appears exactly when you have said no to something unreasonable, when you've suggested seeking professional help for relationship problems, or when you're mentioning feeling overwhelmed by their demands. This tactic suggests that the threat is a response to your independence rather than a result of genuine despair about life circumstances. The conditional nature of manipulative threats is another clear pattern. The threats are explicitly linked to your behavior. If you leave, I will kill myself. If you don't change, I don't want to live. Or you are the only thing keeping me alive. These are causal links. Genuine suicidal ideation typically involves broader despair about life circumstances or mental health conditions, or even just general feelings of hopelessness. When threats are consistently conditional on your compliance, this suggests manipulation rather than genuine crisis. The explicit refusal of professional help is also another crucial indicator. When someone threatens suicide but also categorically refuses crisis intervention, therapy, medication, or psychiatric evaluation, this refusal serves the control dynamic. Genuine suicidal ideation usually responds positively to offers of professional support. Manipulative threats often come with statements like, therapy won't help, medication doesn't work for me, you are the only one who can save me, your behavior needs to change. This refusal ensures that you remain the only possible source of salvation. The pattern of escalation when professional help is suggested often reveals manipulative intent. When you offer to call crisis services, take them to an emergency room, or contact a mental health professional, manipulative threats often escalate immediately. If you call anyone, I'll do it right now, or involve others will just make everything worse. This escalation suggests that the threat is designed to keep you isolated and solely responsible for managing the crisis. The recovery pattern after compliance is another tell. With genuine suicidal ideation, Getting what they want doesn't typically resolve the underlying despair. With manipulative threats, there's often rapid improvement once they achieve compliance from you. The suicidal crisis mysteriously resolves once you agree to their demands, or you cancel your plans, or you abandon your boundaries. This rapid recovery suggests that the threat was tactical rather than genuine. The presence of detailed threats about methods, timing, or consequences if you don't comply can indicate manipulation. Genuine suicidal ideation often involves vague feelings of not wanting to live. Manipulative threats frequently include specific details designed to maximize your fear and compliance. The historical pattern of threats that never materialize despite repeated non-compliance can also suggest manipulation. If your partner has made suicide threats multiple times in response to boundary setting, but has never actually attempted self harm, this pattern suggests the threats are tools for control rather than expressions of genuine crisis. The selective audience for these threats often also reveals manipulative intent. Genuine suicidal ideation typically involves reaching out to multiple sources of support, like friends and family and professionals, or even crisis services. Manipulative threats are often shared exclusively with you, particularly during private moments when no one else can witness or intervene. This selective sharing ensures maximum impact on you while avoiding external intervention. The ability to function normally in other areas of life while also threatening suicide can also indicate manipulation. If your partner can maintain their job perfectly fine, can maintain social relationships and daily responsibilities while also threatening suicide in response to your boundary setting, this suggests that the threats are situational tools rather than symptoms of genuine mental health crisis. Men face unique vulnerabilities when confronted with fake suicide threats from their partners, shaped by cultural narratives about masculinity, protection, and emotional responsibility that make these tactics particularly effective while also making it harder for male victims to recognize the abuse or seek help. The masculine conditioning to be protectors and fixers makes men ideal targets for fake suicide threat manipulation. From childhood, we are taught that our value lies in our ability to solve problems, to provide safety, and to sacrifice ourselves for others' well being. When faced with a partner who threatens suicide, these protective instincts become weapons against us. The idea that our emotional boundaries or desires for independence might lead to someone's death contradicts everything we have been taught about being a good man. Men often experience what psychologists call hypermasculine responsibility when confronted with fake suicide threats. They feel compelled to solve the crisis through their own actions, regardless of personal cost. The cultural message that real men protect the vulnerable makes it almost impossible to see themselves as victims of manipulation. Instead, they view themselves as failing in their fundamental masculine duty if they cannot keep their partners safe and stable. The shame spiral that follows is particularly devastating for men because it intersects with cultural narratives about masculine competence. Men who stay in relationships with partners who threaten suicide often view themselves as weak for being unable to fix the situation. Simultaneously, they believe they would be monsters for leaving someone who threatens death. This double bind creates psychological paralysis, where men feel trapped between their protective instincts and their survival needs. Understanding these patterns is crucial, but recognition alone is not enough. You need practical strategies for protecting yourself while responding appropriately to threats. This starts with the most fundamental shift that you need to make, which is you are not responsible for preventing someone else's suicide. This truth might feel shocking after living under the weight of someone else's threats, but accepting this reality is essential for both your well being and their opportunity for genuine healing. The belief that your behavior determines whether someone lives or dies is a psychological trap designed to control you. Genuine suicidal ideation stems from complex mental health conditions, brain chemistry, trauma histories, and life circumstances that extend far beyond a single relationship. When someone's will to live depends entirely on your compliance with their demands, this reveals manipulation, not genuine mental health crisis. You can care deeply about someone's well being while recognizing that you lack the training, authority, and capability to manage their mental health crisis. Just as you would call a paramedic for a heart attack rather than attempting surgery yourself, suicide threats require professional intervention rather than romantic compliance. Mental health professionals exist precisely because these situations require specialized expertise that a loving partner does not possess. You cannot love someone out of genuine suicidal ideation. Real mental health recovery requires professional treatment, personal accountability, and healthy relationship dynamics. When you enable someone to avoid professional help while sacrificing your own well being, you actually impede any genuine healing process that might be possible. When suicide threats occur, your response should be immediate, consistent, and focused on professional intervention rather than negotiation or crisis management. Having a clear protocol removes the decision making burden during emotionally charged moments and ensures appropriate help is provided regardless of the threat's underlying intent. Contact crisis services immediately without discussing whether this step is necessary. The phrase, I am calling crisis services now because I care about your safety, establishes your response while avoiding debate about whether or not professional help is warranted. Crisis counselors are trained to assess genuine risk. This assessment is their expertise, not yours. Remove yourself from the immediate situation when possible after ensuring professional help has been contacted. You don't need to remain physically present during crisis interventions. Your safety matters, and stepping away will allow professionals to work without complication of relationship dynamics affecting their assessment and intervention. Document the incident immediately after professional help has been contacted. Record the exact words used, the time, the date, the context, where it happened, what preceded the threat, and the professional response that you followed. This documentation serves multiple purposes. It helps you maintain clarity about patterns over time. It provides information for ongoing professional assessment and creates an objective record of what's occurring within your relationship. Refuse to engage in extended discussions about the threat's seriousness or your role in preventing harm. These conversations with your abuser serve the manipulation by keeping you in the position of being responsible for assessment and prevention. Professional services exist specifically to handle those determinations, and your role is to ensure they are involved rather than attempting to manage the crisis personally. Contact your own support system after ensuring professional intervention has occurred. Reach out to family, friends, or a trauma informed coach like myself who can provide perspective and emotional support. Managing someone else's threatened suicide creates secondary trauma within you. Recovering from having your moral core weaponized through fake suicide threats is complex work that extends far beyond standard relationship recovery. The secondary trauma you've experienced is not just about emotional manipulation, it's about having your fundamental beliefs about protecting life and preventing suffering turned into instruments of your own psychological captivity. The realization that someone deliberately exploited your empathy creates a profound psychological wound that's difficult to articulate. When you discover that your caring nature was weaponized against you, it shatters your trust in one of your most fundamental human capacities. You begin questioning whether your instinct to help others is actually dangerous, whether your empathy makes you naive, whether caring deeply is a liability that puts you at risk. Many people respond to this betrayal by building protective walls around their ability to care for others. The logic feels sound. If my empathy was used to control me, then protecting myself means caring less, helping less, trusting less. This defensive response is understandable, but it creates its own trauma. The loss of connection to the very qualities that make you who you are. You may find yourself becoming cynical about others' struggles, wondering if vulnerability is always performance, questioning whether anyone's pain is real. The corruption of your moral compass creates a particularly insidious form of psychological damage. Your protective instincts, which should serve as reliable guides for ethical behavior, now feel suspect and dangerous. You lose faith in your ability to distinguish between genuine calls for help and manipulation tactics. This leaves you feeling morally adrift, unable to trust your internal compass that previously guided your decisions about helping others. The recovery process involves three crucial stages that require support. First, you need to redefine and clarify your moral framework, separating healthy protective instincts from weaponized compliance. This means understanding that genuine care for others does not require sacrificing your own safety. Your moral compass was not wrong, it was misdirected by manipulation. Second, you must regain trust that your caring nature is actually beneficial rather than dangerous. The manipulation taught you that your empathy makes you vulnerable, your protective instincts lead you to harm, and that caring deeply is a liability. Rebuilding trust in these moral foundations requires understanding how healthy boundaries actually protect your ability to help others. Third, you need to reconnect authentically with your caring capacity after it's been corrupted. This involves learning to trust your instincts again while maintaining appropriate boundaries about who handles life or death situations. Your empathy remains valuable. It simply needs proper channeling through professional systems rather than personal sacrifice. This work requires support from trauma informed professionals and coaches like myself who can help you navigate the complex way back to reclaiming your moral foundations. Your capacity for genuine love, healthy protection of others, and authentic empathy remains intact beneath that corruption. The goal is not to become cynical or emotionally guarded, but to restore those values to their proper context where they serve connection and healing rather than control and manipulation. This restoration is possible and it allows you to maintain your caring nature while protecting yourself from those who would exploit it. If you are currently experiencing suicide threats from a partner, remember that seeking professional intervention is itself an act of genuine care. Your well being matters, your boundaries serve important purposes, and your needs for safety and respect reflect healthy values rather than selfish demands. Recovery from this form of abuse to you is possible, and your moral core can be restored to serve love rather than manipulation. You are not alone. This is Stand Again, lived experience platform for male survivors of family violence. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice might just help another man find his. If you're looking for one on one support, you can book coaching with a member of the Stand Again team. Simply visit standagain.com.au, where you will also find grounded information on surviving and recovering from family violence as a man. As always, remember that no matter how many times you've been knocked down, you can stand again.